The universe, as it turned out, had a rather twisted sense of humor. After 3 millennia of galactic civilization, the Triumvirate Alliance had managed to convince itself that physical prowess was directly proportional to the number of limbs one possessed, the density of one's exoskeleton, and how many times one's species had conquered a neighboring star system before breakfast. This delightfully arrogant worldview had served them well, considering they'd spent the last few centuries systematically demonstrating their superiority to every species unfortunate enough to cross their path. Commander Zethkala of the Vraxian Empire stood as the living embodiment of this philosophy. 7 feet of crystalline bone structure wrapped in what could generously be called muscle, if muscle happened to be made of compressed neutron star material. His 4 arms moved with the fluid grace of an avalanche, each hand capable of crushing titanium like a particularly stubborn piece of fruit. The Triumvirate's undefeated combat champion had never met a challenge he couldn't reduce to its component atoms, preferably in front of a paying audience, which made the upcoming interspecies athletic dominance exhibition particularly amusing to the galactic community. The event, designed to showcase the Triumvirate's continued physical superiority over their newest member species, had attracted representatives from across known space. The Krillian Hive Lords would demonstrate their collective combat techniques. The Nexri Battle Saints would showcase their legendary endurance. And the humans, bless their fragile little hearts, would provide what the promotional materials diplomatically termed comic relief. The betting pools had reached astronomical proportions. Not on who would win, of course. That was as far gone as the heat death of the universe. The real money was on how quickly the human representative would be carried off on a stretcher, whether they'd remember their own name afterward, and if anyone had bothered to prepare last rites in whatever primitive ritual their species preferred. Dr. Zenith, the Triumvirate's leading xenobiologist, had published a fascinating paper titled The Amusing Limitations of Carbon-Based Bipedal Locomotion just last month. His research conclusively demonstrated that humans, with their pathetically fragile bone structure and laughably inefficient muscle distribution, represented perhaps the most physically inadequate species ever to achieve spaceflight. It's remarkable they managed to leave their planet without breaking something, he'd noted in his conclusion. One can only assume they invented stairs last. The irony, which the universe was particularly fond of, lay in the fact that nobody had bothered to ask the human representative if she minded being the designated punching bag for galactic entertainment. Kira Valdez had been fixing a faulty atmospheric recycler in Maintenance Bay 7 when the official notification arrived. The message, delivered with all the bureaucratic enthusiasm of a tax audit, informed her that she'd been selected to represent humanity in combat against the Triumvirate's finest warriors. Her initial response, which involved several words not typically found in diplomatic correspondence, had echoed through the maintenance tunnels for a solid 10 minutes. The mix-up, as it turned out, was a result of someone confusing her employee designation KV Combat System Specialist with Combat Specialist. The fact that her job involved beating malfunctioning equipment into submission rather than sentient beings seemed to have escaped the attention of whoever processed the paperwork. By the time anyone realized the error, the announcement had been broadcast across 17 star systems, betting pools had opened, and Commander Zethkala had already begun his training regimen. Well, Kira had muttered, staring at the official documents, this is going to be interesting. What the galactic community didn't know, because they'd never bothered to ask, was that Kira's path to interstellar maintenance work had been somewhat unconventional. Growing up in the underground fighting circuits of New Detroit, she'd learned early that survival often came down to who could hit harder, faster, and with better timing. Her transition to fixing broken machinery instead of breaking functioning opponents had been a lifestyle choice, not a reflection of her capabilities. The preliminary media coverage treated the announcement with the gravity typically reserved for celebrity cooking shows. Local human volunteers for public beating read one headline. Triumvirate champion seeks new personal record, proclaimed another. The general consensus seemed to be that Kira represented either tremendous courage or spectacular stupidity, with most commentators leaning heavily toward the latter. Ambassador Threx of the Nexri delegation had taken it upon himself to explain the situation to anyone within listening range. You must understand, he told the assembled reporters, his 3 heads nodding in synchronized sympathy, humans are a lovely species, really. Quite clever with their little tools and whatnot. But expecting one to compete physically with a Vraxian combat specialist is rather like expecting a particularly ambitious houseplant to win a marathon. The comparison had gotten quite a laugh, especially from Commander Zeth Kalla himself, who'd been gracious enough to comment during his daily training session. "I admire their spirit," he'd said, casually bench-pressing what appeared to be a small spacecraft. "It takes real courage to volunteer for a thorough beating. I promised to make it as educational as possible." Kira, meanwhile, had begun her own preparation routine with considerably less fanfare. Her approach involved reviewing technical manuals, recalibrating equipment, and occasionally disappearing into the station's unused cargo bays for hours at a time. When asked about her training regimen, she'd simply shrugged and mentioned something about keeping her hand in. The scientific community, never one to miss an opportunity for professional analysis, had begun publishing detailed studies on the upcoming mismatch. Dr. Zenitha's latest paper, Probable Outcomes of Interspecies Physical Contests, a Mathematical Approach to Inevitable Disappointment, had calculated that Commander Zeth Kalla possessed approximately 17 times the raw physical strength of his human opponent, along with natural armor plating that could deflect small arms fire and reflexes enhanced by 3 centuries of genetic optimization. The human representative, his study noted with scientific objectivity, appears to be equipped with the standard-issue fragile skeleton, easily damaged joints, and the sort of muscle mass one might expect from a species that considers jogging to be vigorous exercise. The contest should provide valuable data on the exact breaking point of human bone structure, assuming anyone remembers to take measurements between the screaming. The political ramifications had begun almost immediately. Several Triumvirate Council members saw the exhibition as an opportunity to demonstrate, once and for all, the natural hierarchy that should govern interspecies relations. Others worried that the spectacle might be too one-sided to provide meaningful propaganda value. A few had quietly suggested that perhaps beating up the new kids wasn't the most diplomatic approach to galactic relations, but they'd been thoroughly outvoted by the crush them and take their lunch money faction. 3 days before the scheduled exhibition, the arena preparations had reached fever pitch. The Celestial Coliseum, a massive structure capable of hosting audiences from 17 different atmospheric requirements, had been configured for maximum dramatic effect. Force fields, medical stations, and what the promotional materials euphemistically called debris cleanup crews had all been positioned for optimal efficiency. The betting odds had stabilized at roughly 847,000 to 1 in favor of Commander Zeth Kalla, which several mathematicians had pointed out was approximately the same probability as spontaneous universal heat death occurring during the match. The few individuals who'd placed money on the human representative were generally assumed to be either suffering from some form of neurological disorder or operating under the influence of exotic recreational pharmaceuticals. Commander Zeth Kalla had graciously agreed to several pre-fight interviews, each one demonstrating his magnanimous approach to the upcoming educational opportunity. "I want to be clear," he'd explained to the Galactic Sports Network, his massive frame barely fitting in the interview chair. "This isn't about humiliation. It's about demonstrating the natural order of things. Humans are perfectly adequate at what they do best, which appears to be fixing broken equipment and making amusing little noises when frightened." When asked about his strategy for the match, the commander had chuckled, a sound roughly equivalent to an avalanche with a sense of humor. "Strategy suggests the possibility of challenge. I'm planning to be gentle, educational, and efficient. With any luck, she'll remain conscious long enough to appreciate the technique involved." The human media representatives, a small and generally ignored group, had attempted to interview Kira about her preparations. She'd been polite but brief, mentioning that she was looking forward to the experience and hoped it would be educational for everyone involved. When pressed for details about her background or training, she'd simply noted that she'd picked up a few things over the years and preferred to let her performance speak for itself. Dr. Zenith had taken the opportunity to conduct a pre-fight medical examination of both contestants, ostensibly to ensure fairness but primarily to gather data for his ongoing research into species-specific breaking points. His findings, published in the Journal of Applied Xenobiology, had been enlightening. The Vraxian specimen, he'd reported, presents the expected characteristics of genetic optimization spanning several centuries. bone density approximately 4 times that of standard duralloy, muscle fiber efficiency enhanced through selective breeding, and neurological response times that approach theoretical maximums. Quite impressive, really. His analysis of the human contestant had been considerably more pessimistic. Standard Homo sapiens physiology, with all the limitations that implies. Bone structure appears adequate for normal human activities, assuming those activities don't involve contact with anything harder than a pillow. Muscle development suggests regular physical activity, though nothing approaching combat optimization. Most interesting is her apparent psychological state, which seems remarkably calm for someone facing certain physical humiliation. Possible evidence of protective mental breakdown, though she responds normally to standard cognitive tests. The exhibition day arrived with all the fanfare the Triumvirate could muster, which was considerable. The Celestial Coliseum had been packed with representatives from across the galaxy, each eager to witness humanity's formal introduction to their proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. Vendors sold refreshments, commentators prepared their most colorful descriptions of impending violence, and medical teams ran final equipment checks. Commander Zethkala entered the arena to thunderous applause, his crystalline form reflecting the stadium lights in spectacular fashion. He moved with the confident ease of someone who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by hitting it very hard, very quickly. His pre-fight routine involved demonstrating his strength by casually lifting and tossing around objects roughly the size and weight of small buildings, much to the crowd's delight. Kira's entrance, by contrast, was met with the sort of polite applause typically reserved for opening acts at Galactic talent shows. She walked into the arena wearing standard-issue athletic gear that looked almost comically inadequate next to her opponent's natural armor plating. Her warm-up routine consisted of some basic stretching and what appeared to be a few simple movement exercises, leading several commentators to wonder aloud if she'd properly understood what she'd signed up for. The referee, a dignified Altarian with the thankless job of officiating what everyone expected to be the shortest combat exhibition in galactic history, began explaining the rules. Standard interspecies combat protocols would apply, with victory determined by surrender, unconsciousness, or what the regulations diplomatically termed obvious incapacitation. Medical intervention would be immediate and comprehensive, assuming there was enough left to intervene with. Contestants will engage until one is clearly defeated, the referee announced, his voice carrying across the arena through universal translation systems. We remind all participants that this is an exhibition of skill and strength, not a gladiatorial death match, despite what the promotional materials might suggest. Commander Zethkala stepped forward, all 4 arms spread in a gesture of magnanimous confidence. I want to acknowledge my opponent's courage, he declared, his words translated into 17 different languages simultaneously. It takes real spirit to face the inevitable with such composure. I promise to make this as quick and painless as possible. Kira nodded politely and took her position, seeming almost small against the arena's vast scale. When asked if she had any final words, she simply shrugged and mentioned that she was curious to see how this would turn out. The opening bell chimed with all the ceremony the occasion demanded, and Commander Zethkala immediately demonstrated why he'd remained undefeated for so long. His first attack was a textbook display of Raxian combat technique, a 4-armed combination that could have reduced a battle tank to its component molecules. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the inevitable conclusion, which made it particularly surprising when Kira wasn't there to receive it. The commander's massive fist struck empty air where his opponent had been standing a microsecond earlier. He turned, confused, to find her several feet to his left, looking thoughtful rather than terrified. His second attack, a sweeping motion designed to catch her regardless of direction, met with similar results. Kira seemed to have an uncomfortable knack for not being where his fists expected to find her. Interesting technique, she commented, sounding like a mechanic examining a particularly complex piece of machinery. Very powerful. Bit predictable, though. What happened next would be discussed in academic circles for decades to come. Commander Zethkala, somewhat perturbed by his opponent's refusal to cooperate with her own defeat, increased both the speed and intensity of his attacks. The arena floor began to crack under the impact of his missed strikes, and the crowd started to murmur nervously as chunks of reinforced flooring flew in various directions. Kira, meanwhile, continued her apparent hobby of not being where the commander's attacks landed. Her movement wasn't the flashy, acrobatic display one might expect from a skilled combatant. Instead, she moved with the sort of practical efficiency that suggested she'd spent considerable time learning exactly how much space she needed to avoid being hit by things that were trying to hit her. "You know," she said conversationally, ducking under a strike that would have removed her head from her shoulders, "I used to fight guys like you back home. Not as big, obviously, and fewer arms, but the same basic approach. Hit hard, hit fast, assume that's enough." The commander's response was a roar of frustration that shattered several windows in the upper tiers of the arena. His attacks became wilder, more desperate, as the realization slowly dawned that his opponent was not behaving according to the script everyone had prepared. Dr. Zenith, watching from the scientific observation booth, began frantically taking notes. His careful predictions were experiencing what researchers diplomatically refer to as unexpected variance from projected outcomes. The human was demonstrating reaction times and spatial awareness that fell well outside the parameters he'd established for her species. "This is unprecedented," he muttered into his recording device. "The subject appears to be exhibiting combat reflexes comparable to enhanced species. Either our baseline measurements for human capability are drastically incorrect, or this particular specimen represents a significant deviation from the norm." In the arena below, Commander Zethkala was beginning to experience something entirely foreign to his experience: doubt. His attacks, which had never failed to find their target, were consistently meeting empty air. Weiss, his opponent, seemed to be studying him, watching his techniques with the sort of professional interest that made him distinctly uncomfortable. "The problem with being undefeated," Kira observed, easily avoiding another combination strike, "is that you never learn to adapt. You just keep doing what's always worked, even when it's clearly not working anymore." The crowd had gone silent, the cheerful anticipation of human humiliation replaced by a growing sense that perhaps someone had made a significant miscalculation. The betting pools, which had seemed like easy money just minutes earlier, were beginning to look like an expensive lesson in the dangers of assumptions. Commander Zethkala, his crystalline features beginning to show the strain of continuous high-energy combat, decided to end the exhibition with his signature technique, a forearm strike pattern that attacked from every possible angle simultaneously. It was a move that had never failed to decisively conclude any contest he'd ever engaged in. Kira watched the attack, developing with the sort of focused attention she typically reserved for diagnosing complex mechanical failures. At the last possible second, she stepped forward instead of back, moving inside the commander's reach where his massive arms couldn't generate their full power. Her own strike, delivered with the precision of someone who'd spent years learning exactly how much force was needed to disable various types of machinery, caught him directly in what humans would recognize as the solar plexus. The sound that followed was unlike anything the arena had ever heard. Commander Zethkala, undefeated champion of the Triumvirate Alliance, folded around Kira's fist like a piece of origami caught in a hurricane. His crystalline armor, designed to deflect energy weapons and kinetic projectiles, proved remarkably ineffective against a properly applied human punch delivered at exactly the right angle with precisely the correct amount of force. He hit the arena floor with a crash that registered on seismic equipment 3 levels down, his forearms spread wide in unconscious surrender. The arena's silence was so complete that the sound of Kira brushing dust from her knuckles seemed amplified by several orders of magnitude. The referee, after a long moment spent checking his regulations manual for guidance on situations that weren't supposed to occur, officially declared the contest concluded. The medical teams, who'd been prepared for an entirely different type of emergency, scrambled to assess the condition of the supposedly superior combatant. Commander Zethkala, when he finally regained consciousness some time later, found himself in the medical bay staring up at a concerned Dr. Zenith. His first coherent words, which would later be quoted extensively in revised xenobiology textbooks, were a simple question: what the hell just happened? The aftermath proved almost as entertaining as the exhibition itself. The political ramifications rippled through the Triumvirate Alliance like a shockwave, forcing several species to reconsider their assumptions about the natural order of galactic hierarchy. The betting pools, which had seemed like a sure thing just hours earlier, resulted in the largest single-day financial disaster in the history of interspecies gambling. Dr. Zenith found himself frantically revising several decades' worth of research, his carefully constructed theories about human limitations having been thoroughly demolished by approximately 3 seconds of actual data. His revised paper, titled A Significant Reassessment of Previous Conclusions Regarding Human Physical Capabilities, became required reading in xenobiology programs across the galaxy. Ambassador Threx, who'd made such colorful comparisons between humans and houseplants, suddenly discovered urgent diplomatic business that required his immediate attention in a completely different star system. His hasty departure was accompanied by rumors that he'd been overheard muttering something about inadequate intelligence briefings and career-limiting assumptions. The most significant change, however, occurred in Commander Zethkala himself. After several days of medical observation and what his doctors diplomatically termed extensive ego reconstruction, he requested a private meeting with his opponent. Kira found him in the station's observation lounge, staring out at the stars with the expression of someone whose worldview had undergone rapid and involuntary renovation. His crystalline features, normally radiating confidence and superiority, now seemed thoughtful and considerably more humble. "I need to ask," he said without preamble, "where did you learn to fight like that?" Kira settled into a nearby chair, seeming almost amused by the question. "Detroit," she replied simply. "Underground circuits. Bare knuckle. No rules. Fight until someone couldn't get back up. Turns out that's pretty good training for dealing with people who think size and strength are the only things that matter." The commander processed this information with visible difficulty. "But the reports said you were a maintenance engineer." "I am a maintenance engineer," Kira confirmed. "Turns out the skills transfer pretty well. Both jobs involve figuring out how things work and then applying exactly the right amount of force in exactly the right place to get the desired result. The main difference is that broken machinery doesn't usually try to hit back." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel past the observation windows. Finally, Commander Zethkala spoke again, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "I've been undefeated for 3 centuries, he said. "I thought that made me invincible." "Being undefeated just means you've never fought anyone good enough to beat you yet," Kira replied. "The universe is a big place. There's always someone better, faster, smarter, or just different enough to surprise you. The trick is being ready to learn something new when it happens." The commander nodded slowly, his crystalline features reflecting the starlight. "I think," he said carefully, "I may have some assumptions to reconsider." "Most people do," Kira agreed. "The lucky ones get the chance to do it voluntarily." Word of the exhibition spread throughout the galaxy with a speed that only truly shocking news could achieve. The story of humanity's unassuming maintenance engineer, who defeated the Triumvirate's greatest champion, became the subject of countless retellings, each one growing more elaborate and dramatic with each iteration. The practical effects were immediate and far-reaching. Several species that had been considering applying for membership in the Triumvirate Alliance suddenly found themselves reconsidering the application process. Others, who'd been overlooked or dismissed as physically inadequate, began requesting their own combat exhibitions. The Interspecies Athletic Dominance Exhibition was quietly renamed the Interspecies Cultural Exchange Program, with a much greater emphasis on the exchange part. Future events would feature a more diverse range of activities, and participants would be selected based on actual qualifications rather than bureaucratic assumptions. Dr. Zenith, once he'd recovered from the trauma of having his life's work thoroughly disproven, began a fascinating new research project into what he termed assumption-based analytical failures in interspecies assessment. His preliminary findings suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, judging entire species based on limited observation and cultural prejudice might not represent the pinnacle of scientific methodology. Commander Zethkala, meanwhile, had begun training with human combat techniques, working with instructors who taught him that victory didn't always go to the strongest, fastest, or best armed combatant. His first lesson, which proved remarkably difficult for someone accustomed to solving problems through overwhelming force, involved learning to lose gracefully. As for Kira, she returned to her duties in Maintenance Bay 7, fixing broken atmospheric recyclers and occasionally chuckling at news reports that described her as everything from humanity's secret weapon to the most dangerous maintenance engineer in known space. The attention made her job more complicated, but the pay raise had been substantial. The universe, with its twisted sense of humor, had once again demonstrated that assumptions were dangerous things, prejudice was poor preparation for reality, and sometimes the most unremarkable-looking people possessed the most remarkable capabilities. The Triumvirate Alliance, humbled by their encounter with a species they'd underestimated, began approaching intergalactic relations with considerably more caution and significantly less arrogance. And in Maintenance Bay 7, Kira Valdez continued fixing broken things, secure in the knowledge that some lessons were worth teaching, even if the teaching methods occasionally involved punching crystalline aliens unconscious in front of audiences numbering in the billions. The galaxy, as it turned out, was a much more interesting place when nobody was quite sure what to expect from their neighbors.